Well, good afternoon. There we go. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, hello. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and we're happy to welcome Sandra Faulkner back for her second session for today. Sandra is a professor of media and communication at Bowling Green State University, where she writes, teaches, and conducts research on close relationships. She often uses poetry, creative nonfiction, and personal narrative to explore her own negotiation of identity as a parent, partner, and professor. Her book, Poetry Inquiry, Craft, Method, and Practice, won an honorable mention for the 2021 International Congress of Quantitative Inquiry Book Award. And in this talk, Sandra discusses a community engagement project conducted by her students. The project, named Intergenerational Connections, allowed the students to share experiences with older adults, which granted them the opportunity to learn from their perspectives on a variety of topics. As always, I ask if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming back Sandra to Orchestra Hall.
Good afternoon. I am so happy to be here talking with you. So when COVID lockdowns, I don't know if you remember this, right, restrictions began and continued at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember being terrified that I would never see my elderly parents again. They were in poor health and in their early 80s, and I probably should give you a spoiler, they're still around. So now they're in their mid-80s, which made getting COVID dangerous. My dad has COPD, and my mom has a heart condition, so I was afraid that if I visited them, that I would somehow bring them COVID. They live 661 miles south of me in Atlanta, Georgia, while I live in Bowling Green, Ohio, with my partner, daughter, and 3 dogs. In addition to worrying about my parents' isolation and health, as a professor, I was uncertain and a bit wary about teaching online, because we moved everything online, because I had never done it before. And I had even joked to some of my friends that here I was hoping to retire. I mean, yes, I still have quite a bit of time, but having never taught online, that was actually a goal of mine, but it was ruined. I felt disconnected from my students, from my work, and my usual support network. And I needed to do something to channel all of my feelings so I could keep going. And what COVID did was really bring all of our needs for interpersonal connection into greater focus. I study and teach about communication and close relationships, so my sense of disconnection and uncertainty drove me to think about some way to re-engage myself and my students. So I talked with my friend and colleague at BGSU, Wendy Watson, who's a gerontologist and one of my BFFs, about my feelings of disconnection, my wariness of teaching online, and I asked if she would like to collaborate on a project with me. And so, I was thinking of my parents, I was thinking of my students, I was thinking about research that I do on inclusive pedagogical practices, because that's another area of interest for me, and how to engage students in an online classroom. I mean, in some ways, it's hard enough to engage them in an in-person classroom. And so Wendy and I designed the online intergenerational connections project, which I'm going to talk about today. And it was an attempt to ease social isolation for me, for my students, and for older adults in our community. So, the idea was like, okay, we're online, but that doesn't mean that we can't somehow figure out ways to connect with one another, thinking about how can we apply class concepts for the greater good. And the lesson that I learned from that time was how vital our interpersonal connections are. I mean, I always knew this, right, because I've been studying and teaching about interpersonal relationships, right, since graduate school a long time ago, but also about the importance of reaching out across generations. And so in this talk, I want to talk about this critically focused, it was a semester-long project that I'm calling Intergenerational Connections, in which we used Zoom to connect small groups of Bowling Green students with, that were enrolled in my course on relational communication with older adults in a long-term care facility in the Columbus area. My students and I learned some really important lessons about talking across generations that I think we can all benefit from, and this is what I want to talk to you about today. Now, many people hold, I'd say a lot of us, hold misconceptions about older adults and aging that lead to stereotypes. Young adults and older adults represent distinct groups that, who may view one another as different and part of an out-group, and that's part of what leads to stereotyping and misunderstanding, right? Assuming that we have more differences and that we're not, parts of the same kinds of groups. So some of the thinking here is that universities can have courses, just like my relational communication course, that engage myths about aging with students and introduce students to older adults' life experiences with the goal of addressing stereotypes that young adults might have about older adults. And furthermore, including community engagement projects can help facilitate then interactions between older adults and younger adults. In addition to that, the use of technology, so here we're talking about Zoom, is a tool that can be used to dispel myths about older adults and technology use in order to connect, right, young and old virtually, which was important, right, during the period of COVID and lockdowns, and particularly for those in long-term care facilities. And so this project connected older adults with college students for interaction, and the goal was to benefit both generations. And we used Zoom because, right, the lockdowns prevented in-person interactions, and also, we were thinking about the long-term care facilities because many adults who reside in those facilities experience loneliness. I mean, there's been some arguments lately that, in fact, many folks, that we might call it a loneliness epidemic, and they often, older adults in long-term care facilities often report feelings of isolation, right, due to some of the limitations with their social connections, right? Sometimes it's access to technology, although the older adults that we talked to, there was technology, so they used tablets, right, to connect. So that was, they used tablets to connect with students. And now research supports this approach, the idea that intergenerational contact is an effective way to dispel myths and stereotypes that young people have about older adults, including, in aging, including the idea that older adults are boring, slow, conservative, uptight, right, different. And dialogue then across generations can alleviate loneliness, contribute to greater understanding, and dispel stereotypes young adults have about older adults. So this project then was a community engagement project. As I'd mentioned, the undergraduate students in my class then met up with older adults in a long-term care facility, and this was during the spring of 2021. I'm probably going to do this program again in the spring of 25 in person. So it might be interesting to see, right, some of the differences. But what I did is I divided the class into small groups of 4 or 5 students, and so then they were paired up with an older adult in the facility. The students and their dialogue partners met 4 times during the semester over Zoom, so we had 4 sessions. And each of the sessions had a theme, and they mirrored some of what we were talking about in class. So the first session was just a getting to know you dialogue. The second session was the importance of relationships and communication. The third dialogue was about friendships. And then the fourth theme was romantic relationships and relational maintenance. And the purpose, again, was to have students critically engage with stereotypes that they had and expectations through, there were class readings, discussion, and then the interaction with an older adult partner. Now, before the first dialogue, students and older adults then filled out questionnaires. So I had a kind of a questionnaire with some questions, so that way they could get to introduce themselves and to help build rapport. And some of those questions were like, what are some of your hobbies? What are your career plans? What was your vocation? Favorite animal, skills, right? So they used that to then go into that first session. Before the remaining sessions, students wrote out questions in their small groups. Now, obviously, that they could use during the sessions. And that way, too, we also did, we kind of learned as we went along. And so we learned that actually typing out some of them and providing them to the older adult was really helpful. So to have some of the questions. Now, obviously, as students got into the dialogues, they would come up with follow-up questions, maybe different questions if the conversation went in a different way. But students were pretty nervous about that. I'm like, I don't know what we're going to talk about. So that's why I started to have them just come up with a list of questions kind of around, if it was friendships, then around those questions to get them going. During the dialogues then, students took notes and took turns asking questions. And the reason that they were taking notes, so these were not recorded sessions. I did not sit in the sessions. I was kind of in another, if you've been at like Zoom room, right, to then if there were problems, and I would text the manager at the facility, because sometimes we had some issues, and so I was kind of behind the scenes, like working to make the dialogues go smoothly. And the students then took notes, because part of this as well was they needed to reflect on that. It's well to have the interaction, but part of what it was, I had them write reflection journals after every dialogue and session, and then they had to write a final reflection paper where they then looked back over all 4 dialogues. And also as part of the course, students read research about older adults and close relationships, older adults and social support. They read material on relationship processes and social networks and friendships and romantic relationships. And we had a class session on avoiding elder speak and how to work with older adults. As I had mentioned, each student then wrote an individual reflection after every Zoom session. And they also, before the project began and after the project was over, they completed the Ferboni scale of ageism. So it's just a series of questions, right, that ask them about some of their attitudes about older adults. So they completed that before they started, and then they completed it after. And they had to then look at their scores to say, did I have, a big change in this, right, afterwards? And so the idea was that they would then critically kind of examine stereotypes, expectations, attitudes, right, that they had, and noting things about the communication that they had in the dialogue. So they would provide a summary of what happened in the dialogue. I asked them about their expectations, but like, what did you go in thinking was going to happen in that dialogue? What actually happened? Were there things that were surprising that happened in the dialogue? Were there ways that some of your thinking was challenged? And again, after all of the project ended, then students took a look at all of the 4 previous journals that they had written to write a final reflection paper where they had to talk about what did you learn about relationships? What did you learn about older adults talking with your partner? How did these dialogues influence your attitudes about aging and communicating with older adults? I also had asked them if advice that they would give future students who were engaged in this project. So, because I was interested in how intergenerational dialogue then would either maintain or alter students' attitudes and expectations about communicating with older adults, I take a look at all of their journals. And this is what I'm going to share with you as some of what they wrote in their journals, as well as my analysis of the journals and their writing. During the dialogue, students had the opportunity to share their experiences with someone from a different age group and hear older adults' perspectives on friendships, maintaining relationships, death, children, dating, marriage, love, and the importance of close relationships over the life course. These were all the things that students talked with their dialogue partners about. They talked about other topics such as meeting friends, maintaining those relationships, how to know if you're ready for an intimate relationship, the importance of taking chances to do things that you want to do. I think that was really exciting for students. A lot of the older adults were like, you need to sometimes just go for it and take some chances. Overall, the students found the dialogue to be rewarding, challenging, and worth the effort, as this one student's comment reflect. The most rewarding part of these interactions is how this truly changed my mindset on the topic of building relationships with older adults. I will use these experiences when I learned and connect it to my personal life and try to build better relationships with older adults in my life. And many students told me that after this experience, they actually intended to seek out other opportunities to have interactions with older adults, beyond even like grandparents. Their attitudes about communicating with older adults and aging changed to be more positive because of the engagement that the project provided. So I'm going to organize my analysis around 2 turning points. And a turning point are just moments where students experience transition, surprise, and challenges to their assumptions and expectations about close relationships and communicating with older adults. And these turning points were related to aging, relationships, expectations, and developmental change, where they were moving from broad cultural discourses and stereotypes related to aging and ageism to specific personal experiences that they had. And so the first turning point here was perceptions of aging and developmental changes. And I'm going to talk about 2 themes that were indicative of this first turning point. So confronting and challenging stereotypes. Second, stereotypes of aging as barriers to developing close relationships. And so students experienced turning points when they realized that some of their beliefs and stereotypes about older adults did not actually mirror the interactions that they had with older adults. So this turning point centered on how the interaction challenged their perceptions of age and aging. Students found that older adults were not stereotypically boring, slow, and uptight. So none of the students' stereotypes about older adults were confirmed. Over the course of the dialogue, students learned to enjoy the interactions with their dialogue partners as they discovered that they had lots of similarities in interests, concerns, emotions. They found that interacting with older adults who were not their grandparents was meaningful and different in positive ways. They wrote about the value of respecting older adults and their perspectives and embracing difference rather than being afraid of it or dismissive. So this first theme, confrontation and challenging of stereotypes. So what I noticed is that students wrote that they learned to enjoy their interactions with their dialogue partners because they discovered that they shared similar interests and values. They liked some of the same movies. One student was even like, and my partner likes drinking beer. Can you imagine? I mean, so they were, not, were they over 20? Who knows? But anyway, they learned that their stereotypes of older adults were wrong. And students shared how they had stereotyped, older adults as kind of uptight, reserved, uninteresting, and different. But then they were often delighted and surprised to discover how wrong they were. Their dialogue partners traveled. They watched movies. They liked hanging out with their friends, right? Can you imagine? Just like they did. And one student was surprised to learn that their dialogue partner, Anita, hated cooking and did not know every single thing about her grandchildren, which really crushed that stereotype of grandma always baking cookies, right, for the grandkids. The project prompted students to confront their stereotypes they held about older adults. So for instance, one student stated, I did not hold older adults to a very high standard before I took this class. I just thought they were old and could not do very much. Similarly, another student noted, I had this mental image in my head that senior citizens were very uptight and reserved individuals that didn't want to tell complete strangers about their personal lives. I can safely say that my perceptions on senior citizens have changed for the better after having 4 dialogue sessions with Carol. Students wrote that spending time with their dialogue partners changed their negative stereotypes. As this student said, when we started the interview with Betty, I was not thrilled to talk with her. I thought she would just express her opinions and would be a snotty old lady. This attitude has changed. After getting to know Betty, I realized she was just like everyone else, an ordinary person with differences. Students claimed that their attitudes did not shift much, as they liked talking to older people, such as their grandparents, before the project, though their attitudes became even more positive after the project. So even those that said, I didn't really have negative ones, but everyone's attitudes became more positive after the interaction. So for example, one student wrote, my attitude about older adults changed from the beginning to the end of the project because I had more sympathy and compassion towards them at the end. I'd always talked to my grandparents, but this was different to me, a complete stranger and getting to know him and his life. Other students wrote that they found talking with older people was interesting and worth the time and effort and something that they would seek out again in the future. Their attitudes had changed for the better. And no students indicated that their stereotypes of older adults were confirmed. One student wrote, I learned that I find older people very interesting and enjoy talking to them about whatever it is that they want to talk about. I find their history to be very interesting. Other students were interested to learn that older adults experienced some of the same vulnerabilities that they did. One student wrote, the experience of engaging in dialogue taught me that older adults are prone to the same things that younger adults are as far as emotions. After confronting their stereotypes, many students learned to see the value in interacting and becoming friends with older adults. Students discussed how old is just another label, and the benefit of seeing older adults as sources of knowledge because of their life experience. One student wrote that we should be able to learn so much from them if they are given the opportunity to speak, and the younger generations can actually take the time to listen to them. Yet another student stated that the primary thing that I learned about older adults is just how important and knowledgeable older adults are in our modern world. I feel that older adults kind of get pushed to the back burner and deemed as irrelevant by society. Once students recognized that they held some of these stereotypes, they experienced a turning point and started to adopt a more inclusive mindset in relation to older adults. They learned to value their perspectives and see aging in a new and different light, such as the student who wrote, some people judge and treat older adults a certain way just because of their age. And I was one of them, but that is not right. That is not the right way to treat older adults. We must show them respect, and I think we should always have an open mind while communicating with them. In another example, a student discussed how their dialogues not only helped them question their perceptions of age, but also helped them to form a new perspective. And so this student wrote, I think that the most rewarding part about the interactions was being able to see someone who was much older than me share the same outlook on life as I do. I was always under the impression that most older people are largely religious, so seeing someone who was atheist agnostic and thought about death the same way as I do was eye-opening. It gave me a new outlook on getting older and definitely gave me a new perspective on how some older people view life. And I also thought that was kind of interesting because this was actually a faith-based community, right? And so with the student, I was like, well, I guess you didn't have to like take a test, right, to live there. But so some of the second theme was in stereotypes of aging as barriers to developing close relationships. And so students' attitudes did change for the better over the course of the semester because of the time they got to spend together with their older adult partners. And over time, students became more invested in talking with their partners and learning more about their lives. One student remarked that, I felt as if we were doing good to her by letting her know that she's not just old and forgotten to us. They got to see their conversational partners as people. Students learned about ageism and discovered an appreciation for hearing about the lived experiences of older adults. Additionally, another student reflected about how they felt comfortable talking to their dialogue partner, even with the difference in age. And so this student wrote, I learned how communicating with people based on age can be different, but it doesn't have to be. We expect age differences to greatly affect our form of speech and topic discussion, like night and day, but I was able to talk to Lewis about things I talked to my friends and family about. Through these dialogues, some students realized how stereotypes and assumptions from cultural discourse shaped their attitudes about communicating with older adults. One student wrote about how they formed opinions about older people because of those stereotypes and assumptions rather than focusing on the individuals themselves. And this student said, I believe that my attitudes changed due to the fact that I largely did not know the reality of what older adults experience. Another student wrote, I think that my attitude changed because I was able to get a real experience that was enjoyable. Most of my perceptions and preconceived notions that influenced my attitudes came from societal stereotypes and lack of personal experience. So when I was able to change that, my attitude changed as well. I would say my concept of old was anybody over the age of like 65, but then I got to meet John, who was in his late 90s, and it changed my thought processes. The second turning point that I noticed in the students' reflections was one related to understanding and expectations of relationships. And I'm going to talk about the first three of these themes here. So the relationships as a process, dialogue as a mutual endeavor, and challenges to assumptions and expectations about relationships. So students experience turning points when they experience change in their understanding and expectations of relationships within and across generations after engaging in dialogue. Students question their assumptions about relationships, such as age differences being unusual or bad. They learned that building a relationship with their dialogue partners meant gaining trust and reciprocal self-disclosure. The dialogues challenged students' expectations, specifically the idea that older adults would just share their experiences without any kind of foundation, right? They're just going to start talking to me about all of these things. And what students learned is that, you actually kind of have to build a little bit of a relational foundation and kind of get to know one another, right? Just like you would with individuals, right, in your own cohort. And so over the course of the dialogues, Students shifted their view of them as just a course project, right? Like, okay, Faulkner's making me like do this thing, right? To viewing the interactions as vital to developing relationships with older adults, right? So their mindset shifted over the course, right, of the dialogues. And in fact, a few of the students afterwards were like, we want to keep this project going, you know, the things, which again, I'm working on in the Bowling Green community. So I've been talking, you know, with my dean, et cetera. So that's some of the goal is to be able to continue the idea of dialogues with students and community partners across all kinds of difference. So not necessarily just age, but right, all kinds. Anyway, we can talk about that in a follow-up. So this, you know, first theme on that turning point was the idea of relationships as a process. And so the first thing that students remarked on was how building a relationship with their dialogue partner was a process that began with the first meeting and progressed right through the repeated interaction that they had. So by the end of the project, students understood that building relationships takes time. I mean, that's also great because there was a relational comm class, and so we were talking about, you know, relationship processes. And before the first dialogue, some students assumed that the first meeting would just be filled with all of this self-disclosure and that their dialogue partner would just regale them with funny stories. As this one student wrote, you know, going the dialogue, I was expecting to have more of a conversation that we did. Norma took a little time to warm up to us and understand that we were there to have a conversation with her and get to learn about each other. So students realized that they first needed to work to develop a relationship with their older adult and learn about one another before the relationship, right, could progress. So another example, one student reflected, I feel as if my group members and I are starting to build a relationship with her. I can see the conversations with her flow more smoothly. At first, the conversations were harder, sort of awkward and dry. I can see so much growth with these dialogues from the first one to now. In another reflection, a student explained how they began to understand the process of developing a relationship while embracing the differences between themselves and their dialogue partner. So this student wrote, I've been learning what it takes to build a true relationship with someone from scratch and what steps you should take to create that comfortability with each other that can then lead to a friendship. Betty and I are complete opposites. She is old, I am young. She's white, and I am black. She grew up with a privileged life. I did not. She is a woman. I am a male. And the list goes on. Despite us being opposites and living different lives, I have learned there are still ways to find commonalities between people who are different from you and ways to connect and build that friendship. Isn't that lovely? Just thought that was like the student just really, yeah, anyway, I loved that. So one of the second themes was the idea of dialogue as a mutual endeavor. And so students learned that dialogue is a mutual endeavor and that sharing their own experiences, right, reciprocal self-disclosure, would lead to a better conversation. After the first dialogue, students experienced a turning point when they realized that they were expecting their partner to do all the relational work. Like, we're just going to sit here and they're just going to answer all our questions. And you know, then they realized that you know, they had to actually put in some work as well. And students reflected about their decision to also be open about themselves during the dialogue. One student said, you know, I'm willing to share with her a bit about myself as well so that it won't be one-sided. And another comment, I'd also recommend putting in an effort to make the conversation free-flowing, as it helps the dialogues not seem as rigidly structured interviews and awkward. Right? So remember, again, some of them were really nervous, so I had them come up with questions. So then they were like, oh, I've got to ask every single question. And I was like, no, they're just meant to kind of, right, get you into talking. But so many of the students weren't used to actually having conversations. And I will tell you, in another class that I teach interpersonal, we have a whole chapter on how to have conversations. So I really believe in young people too. They want to do this. But anyway, so that was actually part of what some of the issue was here too, is that many of them don't, right, have that. So in another reflection, a student wrote about the evolution of their dialogue, specifically their shift to two-way communication. The student said, "I think we will keep making improvements when talking to Miss Anita. My favorite part about it is that we share our relationship experiences with her as well, so it doesn't seem like an interview. It's more conversation-like." Similarly, you can see that in the following reflection, that this student gained a better understanding of the reciprocal nature of relationships when they wrote, "I learned that relationships require work from both sides of the party, and that it is important to keep in touch with the people that you really care about, because you might regret it in the future." So that was particularly when students were talking about maintaining relationships with their older adults, and they were asking, some of the older adults, like, well, what do you do with friends? How do you maintain those relationships? And so many of them are like, oh, I really have to put some work into this if I want to keep, some of those relationships going across time. That third theme then, challenges to assumptions and expectations about relationships. And so the dialogues really challenge students' assumptions about what a relationship looks like, from age differences to who can be friends. For instance, one student reflected about how the dialogues challenged their assumption that relational partners had to be the same age. And so this student wrote, "I typically think that people are fairly close in age when they pick their lifelong partner, so it's surprising that there was almost 10 years between the two of them." And so that was the dialogue partner and their spouse. Students also learned that friendships could occur across generations. We can see that in the following reflection, where the student wrote, "I believe the dialogue was successful in terms of getting to know someone of an older age and the experiences they went through. I think during these dialogues, we were able to teach some things to older people, and they taught us some things as well. So I think the dialogues were very productive and gave both parties the opportunity to kind of go out of their comfort zone and attempt to build a relationship with someone that is separated by years of age." Students learned that while it's normal to have, we all do, have expectations of relationship, that those expectations should not restrict the growth of the relationship, as this student wrote. "The most important thing I learned about relationships from these dialogues is, first, how you should not judge how a dialogue will go until you put in the effort to talk and get to know the other person you're having dialogue with. It is extremely important also to be open before engaging in dialogues, attempting to build a relationship. It's important to be open because everyone is different, and you never truly know how a person is until you attempt to learn." The students' experiences with older adults prior to this project, such as their relationship with grandparents or a visit to a nursing home, influenced their expectations, right, of the dialogues. So for instance, one student reflected about how their relationships with their grandparents shaped their expectations about their partner prior to engaging in dialogue. The student wrote, "Most of the older people that I have talked to, like my grandparents, seem to just love to talk about anything, everything, and sometimes nothing in particular. I expected the same kind of thing from Betty, which is why I thought the whole thing would be much smoother." In another example, a student reflected about how their expectations about the way older adults converse did not actually match what happened with their dialogue partner. The student wrote, "I always thought that older adults loved to talk about anything and everything, but I felt that that was not the case with Anita. However, she did a great job at creating a conversation with us, asking us of our names, majors, and what we did for a living." So at the start of the project, students expressed their feelings of nervousness about older adults, skepticism about finding value in the dialogues, and doubt about having any similarities with someone from a different age cohort. One student wrote that, "Going into this whole idea of communicating with elders in a nursing home frightened me. I love talking and getting to know people, but there's something about older people that makes me nervous. However, by the end of the dialogues, students realized that their expectations didn't actually match, right, the reality. And one student wrote, "These older adults are not as intimidating as you might think. They just want to have a conversation with you." So to summarize some of the findings from this project, I found that students experienced turning points in their assumptions and expectations about close relationships and communicating with older adults, right, through this project. What these findings demonstrate is that community engagement has the power to help people challenge and transform their perspectives about people that they perceive to belong to a different social group. When students engaged in dialogue with older adults, they found that there were actually more in-group, right, and out-group similarities versus differences, right? I think that that's the important thing. They discovered more similarities, right, than differences. And so, for example, students were very, pleased to learn that dialogue partners, right, enjoyed some of the same movies that they did. I mean, some of them had these conversations, right, about some of the best movies, and that, they liked hanging out with their friends. I really don't know why they didn't think that older adults had friends, but anyway, that was, right, some of their findings. And so the dialogues really helped students to challenge the stereotypes that they had about older adults, which supports some previous research by Burns and colleagues that it's education and interaction together, right? So we could just talk about older adults and relationship processes in class, but you have to couple the education with actual interaction, right, to change or have, an impact, right, the greatest impact. And so we saw that with the intergenerational interaction. In addition, this project supports findings that engaging in positive interactions with older adults can help reduce ageism and prejudice, right? So they got to just converse. I'm going to be really interested to see how doing this project face-to-face, is there, any differences, or not. So the most exciting thing really for me was to see how students' expectations were challenged, as an instructor. And many thought that the dialogues would be a drag, that this was just a course project, but they changed their minds. Older adults are still people, even in old age. Students learned not to use their expectations to judge people. I mean, we all do it, right? And they told me that older people should not be treated differently, right, because of their age. Many students said, I can talk to older people just like I talk to my friends. And then students said, and, I'm my best self when I talk to my friend. Isn't that nice, right? So thinking about that. So what this experience really taught me is the importance of reaching out across generations for meaningful connection, which is something all of us can do. I was impressed with the connections that my students made with the older adults. It was really rewarding to see how they could apply class concepts and make a difference, right, in our community. It made me feel good to think that they were talking to people like my parents and learning that talking to someone older was interesting and actually worth their time. And so this is not just a class project, but I would say it's a call really for all of us to engage in conversation, right, across age cohorts. And the lessons really, I want to leave you with 3 lessons that my students and I learned through this process. And one was the importance of listening across age and experience. Second was the benefit of connecting to those who are not in our age cohort. And 3 was the fact that we all need connection, right, to ease loneliness. And so, so why not, right, talk to someone, right, from a different age group? And so you might learn that you actually have a lot more similarities, right, than you think. Thank you. Oh, that was, I meant to change the slide, so. I'd love to answer any questions or have a conversation.
I actually have 2 questions.
All right.
Number 1, how were the older adults selected?
Okay, so my good friend who's a gerontologist works in a program. So it's a former BGSU student who was in charge of activities at the long-term care facility. And so we just contacted and said, hey, are you interested in a project like this? So,
Second question.
yes.
Did you receive any feedback back from the older adults that were part of this analysis that you
Just
did with the students?
informally. So I just looked at the students' perspectives, right in that case. So it was just informally from the activities director. That would have been interesting as well, but for the project I did not. But that is something to think about in the future. So if I do it face-to-face, I probably will get older adults' perspectives.
Well, what did your friend say? What did she say about it?
Well, I think that some of them really enjoyed it. I mean, the sad thing was that one of the older adults ended up on hospice during it, and so I think that freaked the students out a bit, because then for the last, I think it was the last 2 dialogues, someone else at the facility kind of stepped in, and so they had a new conversational partner. So I think while I think that was a learning experience, it was also right. It was also interesting. So, I mean, I hope that again, I didn't really talk to them about it. I'm hoping that it was a nice experience for them as well. So.
Just as a follow-up, I would be curious to see if the facility itself, you may not want to pull that into your project, but would that facility have some curiosity to develop some conversations following your project, just for their own personal understanding about how these interconnections that you were exploring works on the other side. I think if I worked there, I would be definitely interested in what. And it may bring other programmatic changes into their facility that could be very enriching.
I think so too.
Sort of a mutual partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's definitely something, right, to think about on that end, right, as well. Which is why getting those perspectives would be good.
When I worked with schools, some of the community schools I worked with, one was called the Intergenerational School in Cleveland, Ohio. And they happened to be, their space was in a multi-use, like maybe the Heart Association was there. But anyways, there were older people that lived there, and I mean, they had the best results, and there was always a waiting list to go to their school. So it was just,
oh yeah. Well, and I've heard now too, I've seen that that's been somewhat of a trend in terms of housing situations too, where an older adult might live with some younger folks. Yeah, terrific.
Thank you very much, Sandra.
Yeah, thank you.